In sports, we talk a lot about dynasties and underdogs. We talk about teams that rule their regions and the world for a consistent stretch. And we also talk about the plucky usurpers that upset and unseat the emperors of the game. But in League in particular, these teams aren't always the ones that hold our attention. The teams that really dominate the narrative and the history books are often the ones that dominate the competition. And today, we're ranking the 10 most dominant teams in all of League's history. When we think about dominance, we usually think of 3-0s, solo kills, jungle invades, and quick victories. However, there is a bit more to it than stomping the bracket. Like our top 10 best players list, we're going to discuss what a team needs to get on this list. This discussion won't be as long, but if you want to skip it, there'll be some timestamps for you. In League, there are two kinds of competition, regional and international. And so there are two kinds of hegemony, regional and international. Since League only really has two big international tournaments anymore, not thinking about the regional level basically makes this list a Worlds and MSI best of. So we include regional dominance as part of the equation, but we also consider the level of competition. This way, a team destroying a weaker region over and over doesn't leapfrog over a team that destroyed the best of every region. The latter is a lot more impressive than the former. When we think of dominance, we also think more about peaks than valleys. We're not focusing as much on consistency and long-term legacy. Duration and consistency still matter, but not as much as the team's highest heights and most crushing victories. Remember, the strongest isn't the same as the best. This list favors teams that crush early and pass the eye tests. However, we're going to consider the meta at the time as well. Some metas like lane swaps of 2015 or front-to-back comps of 2016 slowed down the game and reduced the importance of raw lane dominance. In those metas, a team might win 5 or 10 minutes slower, but still be just as strong. Now let's talk about the other half of the equation, the team. When we talk about a dominant team in a sport, we usually don't mean the entire organization and its whole history as much as we do the particular era. These eras centered around a core few players that the team retains. In this list, each team comes with an era. And the rough rule is that as long as the same core of 3 players stays on board, it's the same era. So for example, Samsung Ozone, MVP Ozone, and Samsung White make up one era. The Dandy, Mata, and Imp era. The core JJ, Crown, and Ruler Samsung is an entirely different era. It's like talking about Magic Johnson's Laker versus Kobe's Lakers, or Maradona's Argentina team versus Messi's Argentina team. Now that you know the score, let's dive right into the rankings. We're going to open up this list with one of League's original greats, the classic World Elite lineup. Depending on how generous you want to be, you could start by calling out the Wei Zhao and Messiah era for World Elite back in 2011. Otherwise, you could demand that it start with the Clear Love and Kaomei editions. Either way, they're somewhere around the lower end of the top 10. Early era World Elite was one of the absolute best teams in the world, with perhaps the best individual carry in League's nascent days, Wei Zhao. They were China's clear best team, though not always cleanly. RNG, IG, and other teams could push them to their limit, even at their height. Internationally, they struggled much more, especially prior to the addition of Clear Love and Kaomei. With those two in the lineup, they had two commanding international performances at Enter the Dragon and at IPL 5. At Enter the Dragon, they'd 6-0 CJ Entus and the KT Arrows. At IPL 5, they'd beat Europe's top 3 Moscow 5, CLG EU, and Fnatic, and in mostly clean fashion. In all seriousness, IPL 5 should basically be rated as highly as Worlds in terms of competitive teams, but the squad's peaks were very spotty. CLG EU eliminated WE from Worlds and from Champions 2012 summer. All the same, World Elite was a vital part of early League and the first dominant Chinese team the esports would see. Speaking of a vital part of League history, there was another team that successfully challenged WE's early reign, that being the Taipei Assassins. Season 2 World Champs come in at number 8 for both dominating the GPL and Worlds. As a refresher, Taipei Assassins were insanely dominant in their region. They rarely ever lost games to other GPL teams and went 38-2 in their 2012 season and then 27-1 in their spring season. They were also surprisingly strong at international events, beating teams like World Elite and Najin Empire. When Season 2 Worlds came around, Taipei Assassins had fallen off. As Korea rose, TPA became an underdog story. Within that narrative, it's easy to assume their wins were all nail-biting upsets, but they weren't. Most of their wins were decisive, and this was despite drawing into a very hard bracket. They obliterated Azubu Frost in the early game in the grand finals and out-team fought them in all but one game. They cleaned up Moscow 5 in under 30 minutes in Game 1, then built a nearly 5,000 gold lead in Game 3, mostly through their laning. TPA did lose a game to Moscow 5 and Azubu Frost, and nearly to Najin's Sword, but they were the dominant force at Season 2 Worlds. TPA doesn't get remembered as a dominant team because they fell off pretty hard, especially as their original lineup gradually fell apart. That briefly lived success and brutal drop-off holds them to the lower end, but keeps them relevant. It's more common to see dominant teams come out of smaller regions, like the LMS. When the goal is to win Worlds, the best players in a small region will gradually coalesce into one team. But in a massive region like the LPL, well, let's just say there have been 4 different winners in the last 4 splits. Few teams have genuinely dominated the LPL, and no one has done it like EDG. We have the Clearlove, Deft, Mako era of EDG. This team has had lots of great moments, but with Deft and Mako, they reached new heights. This team won 2 Demacia Cups, 2 LPL splits, and stole away an MSI from Bang and Faker era SKT. Unfortunately, EDG did carry Clearlove's World's Curse and never quite performed there. EDG was interesting in that they were a clever and adaptive team, and they often stomped harder as the series went on. You can see this in their 3-0 over RNG and AHQ, where the 2 games were a mess of back and forth fights, and the 3rd games were pretty decisive. But you can really see it in Game 5 against SKT, where EDG reads SKT in the draft, baits Faker into a bad LeBlanc pick, and then patiently stays in control for most of the game. EDG didn't quite stomp as hard as other teams did at their peak, but they could counter-strat and teamfight so well that they became China's 2nd dynasty, and by beating SKT, they did what World Elite could not.
In 7th place, we have one of the fastest teams in the world. So fast that they dashed onto this list right before it released. This is the team with the quickest win in the knockout stage of Worlds, the best regular season record in the LCK since the format change, and perhaps the best early game team since Samsung White. In 7th place is Damwon Gaming. Something big happened within Damwon from spring to summer in 2020. Whether it was internal discussion, favorable meta shifts, or some kind of anime power-up arc, that change pushed Damwon from a high-level team all the way to one of the most dominant teams that the LCK and World has ever seen. Damwon Gaming not only got first in the LCK, they did it with the best game win rate that the LCK has ever seen. 34-5 or 89%. That's beating out teams like Longzhu Gaming and Prime 2015 SKT. At Worlds 2020, Damwon lost just 3 games in total and never came remotely near falling out of the tournament. Against G2, they had the single most dominating performance in World's history. And you know, it does feel like you should get bonus points for this. Given recency bias, the question will be why Damwon doesn't rank higher. The biggest answer is time. Damwon hasn't reigned for as long, and there's no telling if they do this again next year or totally flop, especially given that they didn't do that well prior to summer 2020. They're also competing at what is a pretty awkward time. 2020 is not the best year for anything, let alone League of Legends. The Korean League they dominated is still also in a weak period. While Gen.G and DRX made it out of groups, they did so narrowly. Analysts like Cloud Templar have also claimed that it's more a Damwon revival than an LCK revival. At the same time, Damwon's clandestine rival, Top Esports, severely underperformed, especially in the bot lane. So Damwon's competition didn't feel as fierce as compared to some of the other teams on this list. Plus, Damwon did it all in a meta that heavily favors early game, making the quick wins a bit less impressive. None of this is to say Damwon isn't a historically great team. You've got to be incredible just to make this list. But when you're deciding between 10 incredible teams, it's very important to consider every bit of context.
EDG wouldn't be the LPL's last dynasty, nor would they be the ones to dethrone Korea. That honor belonged to Ming, Xiaohu, Uzi, and the 2018 RNG, who come in at 6th. That 2018 RNG team kept its core from spring 2017 to the end of 2019. In 2017, they were pretty close to regional hegemony and international success. They got second in spring and summer playoffs in 2017. Then, they lost a grueling best-of-5 against SKT in that same year. That loss in particular raises a big what if. RNG was the only team to really challenge the eventual winners, Samsung Galaxy. If they had beaten SKT, they had a good finals matchup on paper. These kinds of what ifs are what keep this RNG lineup out of the top 5. That and IG. In 2018, Royal would beat IG twice, but each time it was very close. RNG would smack down the rest of the LPL, but IG made them sweat. All the same, RNG had an incredible stretch in 2018, winning 2 regional championships while the LPL was peaking above the LCK, and then winning MSI against 3 regional super teams: 2018 Flash Wolves, Fnatic, and Kingzone, where they went 3-0 against Fnatic and 3-1 against Kingzone. Despite that great MSI showing, RNG is a hard team to rate in terms of dominance. On the one hand, 2018 Uzi was one of the most dominant players League had ever seen. On the other, RNG rarely felt unbeatable, nor did they win all that cleanly internationally. Don't be fooled by the set scores. The Fnatic series could have been a 3-0 the other way if a few things went differently. The 3-1 against Kingzone saw a more dominant RNG for the most part, but Kingzone came dangerously close to clawing their way back into that series. 2018 RNG feels more successful than they do dominant, but they were still an all-star lineup that reached very high peaks by enabling the most dominant AD of all time. Now imagine an LPL team that had 2 of the most dominant solo laners of all time, in addition to a top 3 AD carry. That's the late 2018, early 2019 Invictus Gaming. The Jackie Love rookie and the Shy era IG was a team that bled raw talent. Initially, the talent was a bit too raw. They had a bad tendency to throw games, something that really cost them in 2018 against RNG. However, they figured out their flaws at Worlds and became one of League's hardest stomping teams. They hit their peak right after groups in Worlds 2018. Every lane was a pressure point, every laner could carry, and every player was willing to throw down and back each other up. At Worlds, they would absolutely crush Europe's top teams, Fnatic and G2. Their series against Fnatic broke the record for the fastest finals best-of-5 at the time. IG wasn't without their foils. They did go to Game 5 against KT, but even this Game 5 wasn't as close as the game score let on. IG commandingly won 2 games and very nearly won the 3rd. They lost Game 4, but of course with the Shy benched. According to one interview, the Shy was benched for picking Fiora against the coach's wishes. They won when he came back in. After destroying the knockout bracket at Worlds 2018, they'd win a Demacia Cup and win LPL Spring in dominating fashion. It looked like they'd keep going at MSI. They went 9-1 in the group stage and won the fastest international game ever, beating SKT in only 16 minutes. And then, they lost to a Team Liquid that just barely made it out of groups. Oof. That's the problem with IG. When they're on, it looks like nothing can shut them down. But when they aren't, it looks like they're intentionally feeding. So they're a hard team to rank too. It's easy to put higher or lower based on what you value. The same goes for all the teams in the 4 to 7 range. In this list, IG gets 5th because they had an insane apex of skills and they embarrassed the best teams in the world when they were winning. But they don't go higher because their apex didn't last that long. And when they fall to their lows, they embarrass themselves. Now let's talk about the other Invictus Gaming. You know, the European one. In 4th place, it's Perks and Caps era G2. Much like IG, G2 has 2 best-in-region solo laners, along with a very strong bot laner and an active jungler. They also had a tremendous international peak at MSI 2019, where they broke the record for the fastest MSI finals. G2 followed it up with a strong Worlds 2019 performance. They didn't dominate the tournament because they lost 3-0 in the finals, but they didn't fall off like IG or RNG. They rank higher than IG in this list because they dominate the LEC. They won the last 4 European championships. While they do drop weird sets like the one to Mad Lions, they make up for it by stomping the enemy when it's finally a do-or-die situation. 2 3-0s against Origin and 2 3-0s against Fnatic. They definitely had some close series, like 2 3-2s against Fnatic and a 3-2 against SKT at MSI, because, like IG, they can easily go from dominating to collapsing. Overall, G2 is much closer to the 7th or 8th spot on this list than they are to the 3rd. The gap between the top 3 and the rest is a big one. The top 3 have reached heights that most teams can only dream of. 3rd place fittingly goes to the godfather of all these triple threat teams, the original Season 3 SKT lineup. Pretty much as soon as Faker debuted, it was clear that SKT had a unique talent on their hands. As time went on, it became clear that SKT had 5 unique talents on their hands, as pretty much every player would step up in the coming year. They do well in spring and steadily improve from there. They won in summer and led the OGN in total MVP points and in KDA at most positions. They do even better at World Season 3, winning while only dropping 3 games. They had one Game 5 set with Najin Black Sword, where Black Sword fought tooth and nail for their first 2 wins, and SKT cruised to their 3 victories. In the Grand Finals, one game against Royal was close and the rest were stomps, the third ending in under 21 minutes. That Grand Final series summed the team up well, with Faker carrying Game 1, Piglet carrying Game 2, and Impact carrying Game 3. Meanwhile, Pumandu and Benji facilitated. And that's not even their best. They'd win Champion 2014 Winter and All-Star Paris 2014, which was basically a proto-MSI without dropping a game. SKT 3-0'd Samsung Blue, White, and KT Rolster B, then also swept Fnatic and OMG. This team looked unstoppable all the way up until the summer of 2014, where they finally met their match in form of the team coming up next. In second place is a team that reached a higher peak than any other in League of Legends. A team that overachieved so immensely that they basically reinvented the macro game. It is, of course, Samsung White. In truth, Samsung White only had one moment of pure domination, but it was so intense that it merits the silver medal. A lot of analysts would give them the gold for it. Samsung White stomped through Worlds 2014, dropping just 2 games. One of them where they basically messed around. Their main innovation was in the jungle and the vision game. They deep warded along jungle paths rather than gank routes, finding out the enemy jungler's position and pressuring very far forward in places where the enemy couldn't respond in time. This gave them a very high caliber early game. Samsung White not only topped the KDA charts at every position, they also took the top 5 overall KDA spots. Normally you have to take KDAs with a grain of salt. In this case, the gap between each player and the second person in their position is so much that you can take the KDA at face value. Samsung White also did this in record time, with an insanely fast average game time of 29.2 minutes. That was well below the norm for that meta, something that G2 and IG can't even claim. No team has ever looked quite as unbeatable at such a stacked tournament. So why isn't Samsung White number 1? Well, they only dominated the one tournament. They were a top team before Worlds 2014, but their only other big moment of dominance was in Championships 2013 Spring, where they won the LCK while only dropping 2 games again. Samsung White was an insane team, and they have a reasonable argument for the top spot, but the team above them simply carried their reign and their peak on for longer. Last, but obviously not least, is the only team in League history to win back-to-back World Championships, the Faker, Bang, and Wolf era of SKT, 2015 to 2017. They won 2 World Championships, 4 LCK playoffs, an MSI, and an IEM. At Worlds 2015, they dropped a grand total of 1 game. That's the best win-loss record at any Worlds or MSI ever. That wasn't their only insane showing either. At MSI 2017, they only dropped 3 games. In the 2015 LCK Summer Split, they went 38-6 in games and 18-1 in sets. To top it all off, they didn't lose a game at the IEM Season 10 World Championship. This SKT team had so much plot armor that they made you genuinely wonder if League was scripted. At Worlds 2015, this team regularly fell into a deficit in the early game. They only ever had a solid early game lead once in the semifinals or finals. And yet, you'd be foolish to bet against them because they somehow find the picks, the fights, and the map trades they needed for the win. For some, Samsung White is the more dominant team because they stomped teams out in the early game. However, the game and meta were different. The meta didn't lend as well to the early game, and while SKT could innovate, the game was now too well researched to innovate like Samsung White did. Besides, SKT's reign lasted so long that they overshadowed Samsung White's entirely. Their late game legacy became the thing most players associate with Korean League of Legends. This era of SKT declined in the latter half of 2017, where they lost playoffs to a red-hot Longju Gaming, and then Worlds to an even hotter Samsung. The team's chokehold definitely let up at points, like MSI 2015 and in the summer of 2016. Domestically, they lost to KT. Internationally, they won Worlds 2016, but it was all brutal 5-game battles, not clean sweeps. They may not have had the completely suffocating lead Samsung White had, but they made up for it with a late game so potent that no lead felt like enough. In the early game, some teams may have felt they were the star of the show, but when the late game rolled around, SKT revealed to everyone who the real protagonist was. And with that concludes the list of League's most overpowered teams. Regardless of their rank, each of these teams have contributed to the game immensely, raising the level of play at home and abroad. Who's on your list, and who's your number one? Is it Samsung White? It's probably going to be Samsung White. Let us know in the comments, and if you want to know more about any of these teams or players, be sure to check out our channel. If you want to know about how good the Shy was at his peak, we've got a video on that. If you want to learn about how insane Uzi's career was, well, guess what? We got a video on that too. And if you want to know how the top 3 ended up entirely Korean, or how Samsung White destroyed Worlds 2014, we've got those videos too. And also, of course, if you want to improve at League, be sure to go check out ProGuides.com. But until next time, everybody, good luck on the Rift, stay safe, and wash your hands.